Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So, welcome to our first class of the spring session. Yay. Thank you guys for joining us. If we have not had the pleasure to meet, my name is Rodney. I'm the owner of Garden 17, and I appreciate all you guys being here today. Today we are going to cover our winter cleanup and spring prep for our landscapes, because apparently our winter includes ice every year now. So that's where we're at, you know? You guys are going to have to forgive me a little bit, though I can use an iPad. We're going to kind of jump back and forth. This is going to be our first time with a lovely slideshow for photos for reference, so we're excited about our upgrades. But I will likely stumble through it today, so it's going to be great. So as we jump in, a couple of quick things. If you guys have to use the restroom or need to step out for any reason, by all means, please come and go as you'd like. If you guys have any questions, do not hesitate to just jump in and ask as we go. Of course, the class is for you guys. It is only beneficial if you're leaving with information. So don't hesitate to just kind of speak up, raise a hand, that kind of thing as we go. One quick secret, I know a few of you came in with coffee, but if you guys are ever attending a class of ours, we will always have coffee and tea available for the class itself. So as a little perk, if you will. We will go through a few things today as far as how to kind of get ready for spring, basically. But at the end of the class, just make sure to stop by me. I do have the little voucher coupon for you guys today as well, okay? So let's jump right on in. I got this. Tech genius. Actually, that's everything I already covered. See, I'm so good at this. Let's jump right in. All right, so our overview today. So we're going to talk a lot about how to do our pruning and proper pruning for our different types of plants, herbaceous versus woody plants. Basically, how can we prune to best encourage the plant for the fullest growth for the new year, right? We'll talk a little bit and just touch on oak wilt. Does anybody have any large live oaks in their yard that were damaged by the freeze? Yes, love that so much. I'm so over this ice idea. And the importance of compost and mulch, especially as we get ready for spring. And then, of course, what fertilizers and supplements we should be using now versus what we'll be using in the future once we start seeing our growth. And then we'll talk a little bit about some tools just for efficiency, making sure we're using the right tool for the right job kind of thing. Can everybody see the screen okay, by the way? We were worried about glare. Everyone sees that okay? Awesome. Love it. All right, so let's jump right on in. So we'll first talk about proper pruning. Yes, cool. We'll talk about proper pruning. Of course, some of these photos are some that we've done. Obviously, some are just from the internet. But the general idea here that we'll cover is kind of what we're pruning right now in again, helping encourage that new growth, right? So pruning, and we'll talk about, honestly, I said tools at the end, but we're going to kind of talk about tools as we go to make sure we're using the right tools for the right job. Pruning is going to be very different depending on your plant type. So we've got a few plants in with us today. You know, just our basic perennials, grasses, trees, and shrubs kind of concept. And so we'll talk about the benefits of pruning in the different styles of pruning, if you will. One of my favorite tools that I always have with me is just a standard pair of bypass pruners. These guys are great for typically, you know, if this is the Corona brand, I believe, that I've got in my hand. Yes, it is. These guys are great for typically things up to about 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So you can do even like small tree limbs and such with them, but they're really great for even your smallest perennials as well. Hey, welcome. How's it going? No, you're fine. Grab a seat. Get comfortable. But also, obviously, just being handheld as you're working, they can just kind of stick right in your pocket, so you've got them with you, right? So if you do not have a good pair of pruners, I would definitely invest in a nice pair. I usually tell people the cheapest way to garden is by buying the most expensive tool. The more expensive tool is going to last you longer. When you buy inexpensive tools, typically they do only last for a season or two, unfortunately, and you end up buying more money into them than just the nice pair up front. So just something to keep in mind as you are you know, shopping around for your tools and such. But bypass pruners are great. Keeping them sharpened is great, and we are going to have 2 sharpening events for tools, just so you guys know. One will be in April. Don't mark my words. We'll announce it, of course. I think it's in April or late March, and then we'll have another one for the fall to prep the tools for the fall too. But when we're talking about pruning, so there are a couple of different styles of tools for the pruning, and we will talk a little bit about each of them, but let me grab a pair of loppers here too, so we've got both of them with us. Another pair, or another one to have with you handy is a good pair of loppers, right? This is going to be better for your larger trees, larger shrub branches, things of that nature, right? So let's talk about the idea of something that is maybe like a woody shrub or a woody perennial versus something that is a little bit more herbaceous in its growth, like a grass, right? So obviously we have already done most of the pruning on our grasses on the floor. Usually with your grasses, roses, grasses, in most of our basic perennials, Valentine's Day. Easiest date to remember. It is a great time to do most of your pruning of all of your smaller perennials or your herbaceous plants. I use Valentine's Day as an easy marker. Of course, it always varies depending on like your weather and such and how icy, I guess, our winter is, right? Or still is. But the idea with Valentine's Day is where it's still nice and cool in the evening, but you are getting sun throughout the day to promote new growth, right? Most of your herbaceous stuff is going to actually grow a little bit slower because they've got a finer root system than some of your woody plants will. So, on pruning our grasses, as a real quick one, you can kind of see here, we've already pruned these, so I won't have that one for demonstration, but you want to go with a nice mound. Similar to the photo on the far right here, when we're pruning a plant, what we want to think about is the shape that we're providing to the plant. Are we providing and helping the plant shape itself to where it can get the most exposure to the sun from top to bottom on every side, right? Come on in. When you're pruning a grass, something that's going to be very leafy like that, you want to make sure that you've got a little bit of a dome shape to it, if you will. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, come on in. So when we're pruning a plant, like the photo on the far right here, the idea of where the black dotted line is, if I prune it just straight up and down, I'm not really going to get the best sun exposure to all of that foliage, right? We've all seen that one shrub where it gets trimmed like an outward V and eventually gets bald at the bottom, right? We want to try to avoid that as much as possible. It's actually stressing the plant by doing that, right? Because the plant is needing to struggle to survive with less amount of leaves to do its process of photosynthesis to grow, right? So the idea here in that photo with the dotted line that kind of slants to the left in that picture there is allowing that whole side of the shrub to get the most exposure to the sun, right? So when we are pruning our perennials and small shrubs, we want to kind of think about the same kind of concept there. I grabbed this wild fire bush here because it had already kind of a funky shape that we could kind of prune together to talk about the different style of pruning. But as we can see, if I were to just let this guy grow, most of this upper growth is already growing out past a lot of this lower new growth that's trying to leaf out, right? Right now, it's very easy for this lower stuff to get sun exposure as all of the other leaves are small, right? But as they continue to grow or flush out, this plant is going to want to abort or lose a lot of those inner leaves, right? Because it's not going to have that sun exposure to do so. So what we want to try to explore here is how we can prune this in making sure that we provide it the most sun. Same concept when we get into some of our larger shrubs. As this guy's going to fill out on the top here, we're starting to see that wonderful V shape that we were just talking about, right? So we want to prevent that, and we want to create a little bit more of a taper on that side, right? I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think there's a slide to talk about this, but we'll go to that. When we are pruning too, another really important detail to remember is how you're cutting the plant, right? There is a way to cut our plants that will help promote that new growth and help promote that spring flush, right? So if we think about shape and how to do those prunings, we will, actually I'll just jump right in, we can start kind of pruning these guys. But this guy's probably the best example. Everybody can kind of see that outward V shape that's happening here. If this were something that was in my yard, I would want to make sure, typically I'm using a shrub for privacy and having the green top to bottom, right? A tree is going to be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that guy in just a second. But we want to get as much sun to that lower or midsection of the plant as we can, right? And so in order to do that, I'm going to have to strategically cut to make sure I'm promoting that growth. Sometimes this is very frightening, right? Because we're losing a lot of growth, and we just had this wonderful winter time where we've lost a lot of plants. So sometimes it's very scary to go through this process, but I promise in the long run you will see so much more benefit. So one of the things to keep in mind is whenever you're pruning a plant, your goal is always about a third at a time, right? That's kind of the general rule of thumb. We don't want to take much more than about a third of the plant off each year or each time you prune. Typically, most of your shrubs, you're not pruning more than twice a year at very most, right? But again, when we think about shape, I'm looking at a branch like this guy, getting a little wild, getting out there, and as this leafs out, I'm thinking about the sun coming down onto my plant, and I am going to lose some of this growth down here. So I want to promote as much fullness as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the branch, and you can kind of see on the diagram actually for the rose pruning over here. But what I'm looking for is where is it leafing out that's the branching is going to promote the best growth, right? So in this example, I want to really be able to bring this guy back in to allow this bottom to flush out. So I'm actually going to come all the way back in here on this stem. I'm going to come back pretty far on my evergreen shrubs, right? And I'm looking at this, and I'm finding actually a better one more up. Can everybody kind of see how this branch here has some new growth here on this side as well as this side here? So I would also provide myself a really good balance between the plant and its growth. But what I'm going to notice is how I'm going to prune, right? The angle at which I'm going to prune the plant is going to be also really important. Yes, please.
Is it okay to record this?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. This is also all being recorded and streamed, so you guys will see my lovely face. So we do have a couple of cameras that we are streaming with, and you can find on our Facebook and YouTube, I believe it is. Yep. With the splitting of the branching and how that's happening, what I'm going to notice is I want to go at an opposite angle of the growth itself, or with the same angle, I guess. Sorry, parallel with the growth is what I mean by that. So when I see this smaller branch on this side and it's coming off the branch in this direction, I want to cut the branch in the same direction to promote that growth. All right? Am I kind of saying that the best way I can there? So I'm going to prune in an angle like so we can kind of see that cut there, you know, and how that shape is, to promote that new branch to come off and grow outward. By promoting that growth there too, I'm also, again, allowing myself the best branching opportunity for the plant itself, right? So then I can get the separate branching. Next year, those branches develop, and I'm going to find the same spot, but on both of those. And so I'm promoting that fuller and fuller growth as we go each year, right? So same concept. I'm going to just kind of work my way around the plant so that I can kind of get that promotion of growth. And this guy is truly wild. So I'm going to kind of keep going as I go and just shape this beauty up.
Does it matter how close you cut it to that new growth?
That is a great question, and yes, it does. So what we want to consider is like this cut that I just did here. I'm leaving maybe about 1/4 of an inch or so, right? Maybe a little bit more depending on how the branching structure is happening. But what we want to remember is past that new growth, that branch is dead. So the less that I leave without getting too close to my new cutting, the better. The dead growth on a plant is harboring things like disease, fungus, and bugs, right? So we want to prevent that as much as possible. So we don't want to cut too far out. Let me see if I can find a good example of that. In this branch here, there's no benefit for me to cut out here on the branch itself and leave all of this dead wood, right? Because at that point, again, just harboring bugs, disease, fungus, right? So if we can prevent that, so I'm going to come back in here a little bit further and just leave just, like I said, about 1/4, maybe 1/2 inch, give or take, right? But as little as possible. I don't want to cut too close to the new growth also, because I don't want to disrupt the plant's process. Think about the bark of a plant kind of like our veins, right? And so that's where all the good stuff's flowing back and forth for the plant itself. So I don't want to cut too close and interrupt that or cause some damage to that growth and not get the opportunity of growth there. So on these guys, I'm going to kind of cut back in a little bit further than I maybe normally would, but I'm noticing that, again, I've got all this dead happening here, right? There's just nothing leafing out yet, no benefit to the plant itself. Plants don't have the ability to know that that part is dead, right? So the plant basically is trying to repair all of this branching that's happening. So it is producing energy and it's pushing it that way, trying to repair that growth. So what we want to do is help the plant understand that, hey, we don't need this, right? So we don't want to waste the energy on that dead piece if we don't need to, basically, right? So taking that same concept over here, and we can kind of finish pruning both of these, but you know, we've got a bonsai one here, but you know, we've got a little bit of a funky shape going on here. So we want to, again, promoting as much natural growth in the landscape is going to aesthetically look much better, right, than these very square, boxy pieces. But in a case like this, you know, she needs a little help. You know, we're getting a little lopsided, right? So we want to pick and choose to help the plant promote a little bit more of that natural growth, right? So in an example like this, I would actually probably come back quite a bit on this. Even though I've got all of this new growth at the top here, I want the opportunity of filling this section out, right? So what I'm trying to help the plant understand is that I want you to grow here, not here, right? And just like in the branch example, everything past that new growth is dead. Once I do that to the plant, it's going to go, okay, we're fleshing in this direction, right? So on this one, I would honestly probably come back all the way into here and cut that whole tip right off. And then I would also promote the side shoots here as best I can. So on that one, I had an opportunity of a new branch where this was just a singular growth point, if you will, right? So I'm going to just kind of go through and promote the plant to fill out a little bit better to balance out its shape. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm basically, what I'm aiming for is the angle at which the growth is coming out here. So in this example, if I were to cut this branch again, I would go with the angle of the branching that's happening. Now, you know, that one's got one on each side, of course, but if this were the growth point, I would want to go with the angle of that branch. Also giving the angular cut actually helps shed water from settling in the branch too. So you're also actually helping with a little bit of fungal. Very small amount, but it is a helpful tool. So then once I kind of shaped it up a little bit, honestly, if this were in my own yard, I'd probably go even more aggressive and bring this branch all the way down and in here. But we do want to leave, again, we don't want more than about a third when we're removing from the plant, right? So I want to leave some areas of opportunity for the plant to recorrect itself as well, but we're creating a little bit more of a balance and helping that density of its growth, basically, there.
Is there a rule of thumb for if you have we've got a silver there on the front that damaged by the freeze?
Uh-huh.
And we're not sure exactly what branches are dead
Yes.
versus alive. And
Yeah.
it seems like he's really been knocked around.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it might be more than a third, but we're a little hesitant to kind of even touch them.
Did you say it was a sage?
It's I think acacia.
An acacia, okay. Was it covered this winter? Or was it fully exposed? Okay, all right, cool. So acacias can be a little bit sensitive with the cold, is why I ask. A good rule of thumb on an example like that, especially from freeze damage. So similar when I was going to use that for when we talk about the tree too, so I'll tie that all together. When you're looking at the plant and its growth, the best practice is notice if the cambium layer is alive. And basically that's when we scratch the bark and we see a little bit of green underneath. Right? So every plant is going to have some life underneath that bark. Sometimes it's lighter green, sometimes it's a little darker green, right? But if you scratch the trunk and it's any sort of brown or tan in color, that's a really good indicator that that branch is likely dead. And usually what I do to assess for freeze damage, so kind of tying that into all of our plants as well, any plant that has gone through a wonderful winter like we've had, I usually start kind of at the top about 6 inches in or so if it's not leafing out, because a lot of times we'll see the leaf come from the bottom first, right, because that's where the root in the plant was most protected from all the ice that settled in. We'll start to see that leaf out. So what I'll do is I'll kind of start at the top and just slowly start scratching the bark until I find a place of green, right? So in that example, it might be more than a third. But we're also helping promote removing all of that dead growth to where the new growth is. So you're going to have better success for the plant at that point. Unfortunately, when you do trimming like that, you may end up with a little bit of a funky shape for that first year. But if you're pruning, you know, thinking about how the branching's happening, that secondary year, often you can correct it after the second time, or after the second growth of season, right? But yeah, that's a good way to do it, is kind of just what we call the bark scratch test, right? So you kind of just start scratching and then you go, oh, I've got some green here. Cool. There might not be leafing out there, but at least we've got some green. And to help the plant, because again, it's trying to repair all that top stuff, you want to remove that about this time of year, right, as we start to warm up in the evenings again, so that it can establish its roots and leaf out where it can. But if it's spending energy with about half of the plant that's dead, it's just, you know, running on a hamster wheel, if you will, right? So we want it to spend energy where it's going to have the most success. Yeah, absolutely. Any other big questions on just the pruning and the cutting method itself? All pretty good there? Awesome. Let me jump over here real quick.
Is there
Yeah?
anything unique with roses that you can find?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's talk about roses specifically. So with roses, there is what they call the 5-leaf rule. So when you're pruning your roses, usually sometime between Valentine's Day and end of February, so about right now, right? Yeah, you got it. You got it. Yeah, right now. Right now's the time. Go home and prune your roses. You want to use what they call the 5-leaf rule. So basically, when you prune a rose, very similar to the angle and all of that, it becomes very important for the growth and the hormone on a rose. But you want to go back to the 5-leaflet. So I didn't have a really good example, but this photo does pretty well for us here. So you can see in the photo, there's a leaflet of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then here's our first 5 leaflet. Typically, most people cut at the point of 2, where it's balanced on either side, but it depends on your rose variety. This is a really good rule of thumb for a lot of your antique roses. If you've got things like knockout roses or Martha Gonzalez or the drift rose, you can typically cut at the first 5 leaflet that you come across. But most antique roses or roses with a really that produce a lot of scent, you know, that style of rose, you want to go to where you've got a 5 leaflet on either side of that main branch. And so sometimes that is more than a third. Roses don't always follow that 1/3 rule, but the 5-leaf rule is a good one for a rose. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please.
For prickly pears, ours, kind of melted like candles.
Yeah.
Is there any thoughts on kind of how to recover? We got some that lost like an arm, so he's lopsided, and we have one that just kind of was all the way down to the bottom of the wick.
Totally.
Puddle.
Yeah.
Kind of how to recover for those guys.
So the off-balance one is probably the easiest. So if you've kind of lost a limb, if you will, right? What you would do is you'd want to remove a couple of pads on the other side. So bring it in a couple of pads, and really what you're trying to do is relieve the weight because it's no longer balanced at that point of growth, right? So, you know, similar to a tree losing a large limb, same kind of concept. So I would say bring it back a couple of pads. The wonderful thing about you know, the cactus is you can take those pads and put them right in the ground. You got a new plant, right? So yeah, those are really easy in that way. So if you've kind of lost one side, you can bring a couple of the pads back on the other to balance out the weight. Unfortunately, the ones that you don't have any green left and they've just kind of melted like a candle, it's a great description. I'm going to use that. Melted like a candle. It's really what they look like. The best you can do is try to cut them at ground and hope that the root stock is still there and it may regrow, but honestly it'd probably be a lot faster for the healthy one that you do have, those pads that you remove, replant those pads.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, unfortunately. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool,
yeah,
cool.
100%.
All right, let's see here. All right. So that's another great example of the shrubs that we were talking about earlier, right? When we end up with an outward shape of a V, we get this kind of this naked or this bare space down here, and that inevitably is stressing the plant, right? So to get the long-term success out of that, often where I see these is in the like commercial sector. You know, we see them in the Texas sage, right? They try to do that perfect square with them, and inevitably you have half a bald plant and then some leaves on top, right? So instead, aim for more of a pyramid when you're pruning, right? When you kind of step back and you look at your plants, aim for that kind of general pyramid shape. That's going to go a lot further for you than the idea of just trying to go straight up and down. Most of your plants self-maintain, right? And what I mean by that is similar to what we're talking about with the dead tips or the dead growth areas. Most of the plants tell, you know, they know, hey, this isn't going to come back, but they're still trying to repair it. So when we come in to help with the landscape, we want to remove that so that the plant knows there's no need to repair it, right? Let me kind of help you along the growth. A great example of that photo is how this guy is going to grow out. These Elaeagnus are also notorious for it because, as you can see, they just kind of grow out and grow straight up, right? So on these types, what I would really do, especially if you've, again, Texas sage is another great example, but same concept here, I would go around and all of these guys at that outer edge, I would start tapering off, right? So I would look at nodes where we're starting to see our leaves bud out, right? And I would go again, proper angle, and start cutting that. And I would honestly work my way right around the edge to bring those in. And again, kind of noticing the angle at which I need to cut, right, to promote that growth. And that's just going to make for a much happier, healthier plant. And we're not going to compete for sunlight as we're growing, right? So now, as we can see, a lot of those cuts that I just made, always scary because it looks a little bit bald, but the minute it warms up, you're going to have such a prettier shape and a much more natural shape to the plant as we taper upward like that. Yes, ma'am?
Can we cut the notes for like knockout roses? We've got some that are really leggy.
Totally. So one great thing about a knockout rose is that it was basically created and bred to give us a rose in Texas that could handle Texas, right? So the knockout rose is a really great drought-tolerant, heat-tolerant variety, which means they also take a beating really well. I about had a stroke, to be honest, when I planted one for my mom years ago, and she said, "Oh, I pruned the rose," and I was like, "Oh dear, okay." And I went over and it looked about like this, to be honest. And I went, that's not, I think we went over this, you need to attend a class of mine, is what I told her. But when she did that, she did actually promote, she at least made proper pruning in that method because she was going through the same thing you're mentioning, where you've got a lot of growth in the center here, and then it's filling out on the top kind of concept. I would definitely bring that back, and right now is the time, as we mentioned, end of February is today, basically, right? So go home and prune it today kind of thing, and you'll be totally fine. Keep this shaping in mind, though. So even though you've got a lot of leggy sections, when you are doing that pruning, even though they're going to be bald stems right away, give it a little bit of that kind of globe shape so that you're tapering outward, right, in your pruning, so that way everything's getting the sun evenly, and when it does reflush, you'll have a much fuller aesthetic. That'll promote blooming a lot better too on the roses. Any other big pruning questions on that one? Yes, ma'am.
Take any of the top off there?
In this particular one, I wouldn't, just because it's so young. If it was in my yard, I totally would. Yep. I definitely, kind of these longer, straggly ones here, yeah. I definitely would. I would prune those so that way I'm getting that denser effect as it's growing, similar to what we did on the side. But yeah, that's a great question, because this one being young and ready to plant kind of thing, I wouldn't in this case, so that I know it's got good energy. But for right now, being young, I wouldn't. But again, if this was an established one in my yard, I definitely would taper all of those off as well. Yep, great question.
And for these guys, we've got about a dozen of those.
Yeah.
We cut them to about a foot.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's right. And then again, kind of a tapered shape off to the edge. Yep. Dome for grass is an easy way to describe it. You see the little mounds that they make with them. Yep. That's the best way to promote your balanced growth. Now, the one weird thing that we did see with our grasses this year, and I even noticed it with some of my perennials, what was it, 2 weeks ago, and it was 80 and we were in shorts and a tank top, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Grasses grow so quick that they were already starting to flush, right? And we're kind of seeing that in here, the mixture of new growth and the old growth, right? So sometimes with your grasses, you may need to pick an earlier date to get at those. So those might sometimes be in early February. So I would say if you know we're going to have a good week to 2 weeks of random spring in February before it gets cold again, your grasses might be one of the first things that you decide to go out and attack, if you will. Cool, so let's talk a little bit about oak wilts. Is everybody familiar with oak wilts? So okay, cool. So oak wilt, basically, oak wilt is going to be most on your oaks, right? It's caused by a little bug and roots touching or branches touching, right? That can transfer this this disease around. I did give a quick little description, but it was actually first found in the 1940s, and it is something that can spread like wildfire. I don't know if how long everybody's been in Austin, but I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, if I remember correctly. No, it was probably more than that. It was probably closer to 8 to 10 years ago now. But the Circle C area, including the Wildflower Center, had a huge problem with it. The Wildflower Center, to protect their trees, they actually went through in about 20 foot out from the outer edge of a lot of the canopies. They basically dug a moat around their trees to make sure that none of the roots were touching to exposed trees to oak wilt. Oak wilt is kind of a death sentence, unfortunately, but if you can catch it early and you can prune off the affected areas, the better. But a way to prevent it from spreading is not pruning in the growing season, basically. So what happens when we get an ice storm in February when we shouldn't cut our live oaks, right? That's a really difficult one. The benefit of the cold during those times, though, is that it does delay the growth of the tree, and it does delay that little organism that's moving them around, which means that our roots aren't doing a ton of development either. So it does kind of slow down the process and buys you a little bit of time as far as cleanup. But if you do have any large live oaks that need cutting or have lost any limbs, there is what they call a pruning sealer. Okay, there's a paint-on variety as well, if you've ever seen that, usually like a quart-sized paint can, but this is like an aerosol or like a spray paint. The benefit of this for our oak wilts is, our oaks, to prevent the oak wilt, is it immediately seals the cut. If you've ever seen an oak tree or a large established shade tree with the little black paint on it, that's what that is it's basically sealing the cut. What we want to prevent is it's that outer cambium layer we've mentioned before. The minute we expose that to air, it's vulnerable immediately almost in our growing season here. So if you do have any live oaks or oak varieties in general, because it can stay dormant, we have found in some other oak varieties, just make sure to prevent your major pruning from February to June. That's really the general rule of thumb, right? Again, having gone through the ice storm, I thought it was at least important that we talk about the idea of the pruning sealer because it is a helpful tool to clean up from, like I said, the ice damage in the storm and such. If you guys have needed to hire an arborist, I would definitely ask them if they plan on sealing the cuts this time of year, okay? That's gonna be a real big one. Most of your arborists in Austin will recommend it this time of year, so you're gonna run into that inevitably. Off season, or when we should be pruning our oaks and our large shade trees, basically about November through January, right? You don't typically need to seal it. That's a safe time, and really the ideal time to be pruning our shade trees. So what I typically say, and you'll hear me say it on the floor often, don't use the pruning spray because you shouldn't be pruning when you shouldn't be pruning, right? So avoid pruning if you can, but again, right now with that ice storm, it's really difficult to avoid that situation. So pruning spray is really great for the oak wilt. When we talk about pruning a large shade tree as well, let's use this guy here as an example. So this is, can everybody kind of see how it's starting to bud out? The leaves, okay, cool. So this is really the time of year where you're gonna really know where that growth is coming from, and that's why it's sometimes a little bit difficult, but it is always best to prune a shade tree in the cooler months where we are still a little bit warm during the day, because that is what's gonna allow it to focus on its root development all winter long. And that's really what we want from our trees. A little bit different from our shrubs and perennials, right? Where we wanna do it when they're developing at the same time. But for the most part, we do really wanna promote our trees to focus on their roots during the winter season and not their growth, right? So again, same concept. We want to think about how the sun is coming into our trees and hitting our canopies. If you've got a small tree like this where you can reach all of the branches, great. Small set of pruners is all you really need, right? If it's a little bit bigger, that's where the loppers come into play, right? That's going to be these bigger guys. They're going to have a little bit more force and reinforcement, and they're going to allow you to cut a slightly larger branch, right? These are the two tools that I use at home, to be honest. I do have a pair of shears, actually, that I will use for my grasses often, but these are the two tools I really use. Same concept applies though when we're pruning a tree, right? We are looking for how it's growing, right? Where that new growth is going to come from, and I'm going to pay attention to the angle at which I'm cutting. Now, if I were to be planting this tree in my yard, to be honest, I would actually probably remove a lot of these lower limbs almost immediately. And the reason for that is to promote growth upward and to allow the roots more energy, right? I'm not going to particularly prune this one today. This is a ginkgo tree. If anyone's never had one, they're absolutely beautiful, but there's a big fan club around them, and they would kill me if I trimmed it right now. So I won't do that. But if it were mine, like I said, I would take off the first ring or first set or two of lower branches when I plant a tree to make sure that the sun is hitting the canopy as it needs. And if you notice, I'll try to turn it this way, most of the time your lower branches are not going out as far as your larger, more mature branches as the tree continues to grow, right? So again, as we talk about the sun and how it's going to hit this canopy, these guys really aren't going to be exposed to much sunlight anyways. So save the tree the energy on trying to keep them the minute I get it planted.
So how far up would you go?
So I would typically on a tree, I only do the first ring or two of branches. Yeah, I usually keep it pretty low. It's going to vary a little bit. You know, if there was another set that was also inward like that or smaller, I would probably take those as well. But if I were to take these off, pretty much everybody's going to be exposed evenly at that point, right? So I would probably leave the rest, to be honest. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I get a question a lot right now with the ice storm and how it happened. We can kind of see like this guy's got a main branch that's happening. Obviously your trees have got your main trunk. What happens if I lose the top of that piece, right? It's all about balance, unfortunately, right? There are certain varieties that are just never going to fully mature properly, losing that lead. So a live oak, not necessarily one of them, right, in the way its growth habit happens. But a ginkgo, unfortunately, would be one of them. So a pecan tree, that's another great example, actually, or pecan trees. Those are great examples. There's one down, if you're headed south on Lamar, there's always this beautiful pecan tree on the side there, but it lost its top in the 2021 freeze, and then I noticed it basically split the trunk in this past freeze, right? So a lot of times with our shade trees, we also want to consider the amount of safety and the hazard that it's bringing to our spaces, right? So there are certain varieties where if you do lose this main lead, it's probably time to start investigating a slow decline of the tree and how you can manage that a little bit better, right? Just for your own safety. But there are some other varieties where with some proper pruning and some proper care, they'll recover, right? So it definitely does depend on the variety, for sure. Did anybody lose major shade in their yard this year from the ice storm, having to lose a large tree or anything? No, okay. So another thing that we keep running into right now is that we've had some folks that have lost like major branches, and they went from a shade garden for 20 years to a full sun garden now. That's going to be a challenge, right? Our plants that we're used to establishing in that shade and having that protection from the sun, that's going to be another little hiccup or another challenge there. So just things to kind of keep in mind. Any other big questions on oak wilt? All good there?
Is it exclusive to oaks, or can it get into pecans and stuff?
I'm sorry?
Is it exclusive to oaks, or can it get into pecans?
It is. It's going to typically be oaks. Yep, it's going to be that typical family of tree. Now, the organism that transfers it can live in other plants, but the oak wilt disease itself is pretty exclusive. Yep. An unfortunate VIP.
Off subject a little.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah.
The stake on that tree. How long would you leave a stake?
That's a great question. So if I'm planting right now, kind of our second fall season, right, where we get those warm days, cool nights, if I were planting right now, I would likely leave that all the way through the fall. So typical rule of thumb is anywhere from about 6 to 12 months, depending on the variety. What it's doing is the plant is pretty reliant on that in its grow pot because it hasn't established its lateral roots yet. So if we can get a good 6 months out of its lateral growth, typically it's got enough strength in the soil itself where it's kind of blended its existing soil to our existing soils in our sites, where it can start to hold itself a little bit better. In general, of thumb, 6 to 12 months.
I had planted an anaconda orchid,
Mhm.
and I left the stake in for like a year, and then it's kind of grown that way. Should I just like hard prune it on the one side to try and
Yeah, you definitely. Does it have multiple branches at the base right now?
I cut them all off.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's got kind of the one main lead and it's kind of hanging out to the side. Yeah, you can definitely promote balance by pruning. So yeah, you could definitely do some hard cutting on the left side of that. Exactly. Yep. So you could definitely do promote that balance by that hard cut.
It's starting to bud a little bit. Is that okay?
That's totally fine. That's actually going to be helpful for you right now because then you're going to know where that safe cut is. Yep, exactly. And if there's any dead growths from the winter. Yeah, absolutely.
It gets a lot of dead growth.
Anaconda orchids are kind of known for that, unfortunately. Yeah, but they grow really fast, so kind of makes sense. That if if they're typically with a plant that grows fast, they can lose limbs faster in that way.
So like during the summer, sometimes I'll see like dead branches
Totally.
Is it okay to go ahead?
Absolutely, yeah. One big thing to know about pruning, you know, a lot of what we're focused on today is like the hard pruning that we need to do to prep for the spring, but pruning you do throughout the year. So another set of pruners that I was going to talk about too are like a small set of shears like these. These guys are really nice for deadheading your perennials, right? So once they've bloomed, to go through and cut that more herbaceous stem from the flower itself. But they're really helpful for, to your point, anything you kind of missed in your early pruning. Or sometimes plants just abort, you know, a small little section of branch or something of that nature, right? So these guys are really nice for that as well. But yeah, you can definitely prune for shape and aesthetic all year long.
Anything that needs to be done for pruning for like star jasmine or kind of those viney guys?
Yeah, that's great. So vines are always going to vary a little bit by variety, but star jasmine's a great example of that because it's more of a woody vine. You don't typically tip cut or prune your vines because it's one main, you know, part of growth. But after a winter like we had, I would imagine you're going to definitely have some cleanup to do. So I actually have like 3 star jasmines in separate areas of my yard. One died back completely. I don't see any sign of life, unfortunately. And then I've got another that's about 50%, and then one where I think I had to cut one piece, and she's thriving, right? So I would definitely say that's going to vary a little bit. I would look for things like damage or breaking in the stem. A lot of times in a smaller stem, especially like a vine or a more herbaceous plant, when the freeze happens, it expands the cells, and so it'll like crack the stem, right? So I would just kind of do a quick inspection, especially on your main branches from the vine itself, just to look for areas of damage, basically, and then use that. You can definitely use the scratch test for that. Anything with a woody exterior, the scratch test works for. Yep. Any other questions on that stuff?
Would the same go for fig ivy?
Fig ivy is going to be a little bit more tricky. So I, like a silly person, planted a whole bunch of fig ivy in November. I don't know what possessed me to do that. I only have about 2 of them that look like they're going to be coming back. I was just wanting to fill in. I was being impatient, you know. It was beautiful, so I did. Yeah, I'm only seeing about 2 of them with some growth right now. Mine were really young, so they did have a little bit of that. You know how its first growth is a little bit herbaceous, and then it kind of turns woody as it matures, right? I had a little bit of a bark down there that I could scratch and saw some green, and so I just kind of cut what looked dead, and to prune it out of there. But if you've got one that's a little bit more mature, where you can do the scratch test a little higher up, that same rule would apply for sure. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Any other big questions there, guys? All good? Cool. We'll keep cruising through. So let's jump into talking about our soils and mulches. I don't know what that's doing. All right, cool. So let's talk about compost and mulch. One of the big things to understand is that our compost is going to talk about, you know, what we often reference is compost is root health. Right? That's everything in the ground that's creating that solid, healthy foundation. We were talking a little bit early on in the class, but the way I usually tell people is your soil level is like the foundation to your home. Right? If you have good soil, your plant is going to be as healthy as it can be. If you've got a good foundation, your walls don't crack, right? If you've got a questionable foundation or your foundation shifts, you know, your walls can crack kind of concept. So same goes with plants. Your soil is your foundation for your plant. Often you hear the saying, put the $1 plant in a $10 hole versus putting a $10 plant in a $1 hole. You are always going to be more successful if you set up your soil from the beginning. One of the things that we actually talked about early was compost is expensive, right? That's one of your most expensive pieces of gardening. But having that soil healthy from the beginning, you start all of those microorganisms, you get that little ecosystem happening, and it will naturally become healthier on its own as you go throughout the years. It's really difficult to not do it up front and have to add to it later around your plants, right? The other thing that you'll notice is that you'll spend so much money replacing plants if they don't have a good, healthy start in the soil itself, right? So a couple of the things that you'll hear us talk about when it comes to soil is the mycorrhizal fungal. That's basically a beneficial bacteria that attaches itself to the root system, and it helps beef up the root system. You find it mixed into a lot of products already. So the main compost that we carry, which is by Nature's Creation out of San Antonio, is a mycorrhizal fungal in the compost itself. Basically what that's doing is helping beef up that ecosystem in the soil, right? What I like about this compost too is you get a good mix of some fine texture and some chunky texture. If you live anywhere near Austin, your soil is heavy, thick clay, right? So both become very beneficial for the soil. If your compost is too screened, right, where it's very, very fine texture, sometimes what you'll notice is that adding the compost into the soil, into that heavy clay, and coming back that next year, your soil is even more compacted than when it started, right? So the chunky mix in there helps offer that balance of getting some oxygen into the soil. Our clays actually have a lot of really great nutrients that our plants want. There's iron and such in our soils that plants want, but we have to release it out of that soil, and the compost is what helps break that down, and it gets some good air into the soil. General rule of thumb is you want about 25% air in your soil. But our clays compact and compact and compact, and they squish all that air out of there, right? Plant roots want oxygen, right? If a plant is overwatered, all that happened is that it drowned because of the lack of oxygen, and a fungal was able to take over. That's all that really is happening there, right? So same thing can happen in our heavy clay soils. If there's no air, there's no flow for the water, right? That can get really locked up in there, and again, kind of cause those health issues. So compost, super important, right? That's going to help prep all of your soils. That's going to help prep your foundation. Mix that in whenever you can, honestly. Mulch is the other big one, especially in the spring. As we start warming up, that top layer of soil can dry out really, really, really quickly from the sun, right? We also go through some windy patches. So the mulch is going to be another really good one to help keep that soil hydrated. Let me skip to this next slide because these are products that you can then add. Yes, sir?
This may be a dumb question.
No.
Does the color of mulch matter? Like, does black mulch attract more light and get hotter? Like,
Sure. So color, not necessarily, but colored mulch does mean that it's been dyed.
okay.
So that is one downfall with mulch, is you can buy like red mulches and black mulches and such. They are dyed. I'm not a huge fan of that, only because there's no organic dye in that way that they're using, right? So you are adding a chemical into the soil. It can look really, really nice, but I would definitely suggest our native hardwood mulches because they're dark enough to begin with, you know, and just refresh it maybe 3 times a year instead of twice a year, right? Just to keep that darker color. Temperature-wise, if your soil is composting properly, it's creating a lot of heat naturally on its own, so I wouldn't worry about color of mulch creating that problem too much.
Is there a ratio for compost to like our native soil, like clay?
Yeah, totally. So the easiest way to kind of measure that, if you will, is when you go to prep your hole for your plant, you want your hole to be twice as wide and typically just as deep. But our heavy clay soils, I break up a little, you know, a couple inches deeper, right? But when you take all that soil out, the general rule of thumb is about 50-50. You want about 50% compost to that 50. Now, when you are prepping an entire bed, I usually use about the 30% rule because at that point you're covering so much more space, and you're always going to add a little bit of compost every planting you do. So usually when you do an entire bed or you're just prepping a brand new bed, I use about the 30% rule for that. So about 30% new material. Yeah?
I don't know if you're going to talk about this.
No, you're good.
For plants that are already like in the soil, like you need to add more compost and stuff.
Yeah, so spring and fall are the 2 seasons to really add a top dress of compost. Typically I do about 1 inch to 2 inches in my bed, depending on the beds, and then I use like a pitchfork or just a spade shovel to kind of mix that into that top layer, right? Another really great product for that is this Microlife product out of Houston. These guys are an awesome company. If you've never used Microlife products, the first time you use it, you will stick with it because it's awesome stuff. It is the Cadillac of fertilizers though. So, but what this is basically a concentrated compost. So this is a quick way to get just kind of that rejuvenation into the soil without needing to do truckloads of compost. So we have what are these, 7 pounds, 9 pounds, something like that, and then we do the big, large 40-pound bags as well.
So you do that with some compost?
So when I do my initial plantings, I mix this with the compost for sure. When I'm just doing it seasonally to like prep the bed and get it ready, typically I'll spread this in, mix in the mulch that I had before, till that into the soil, and then put my new mulch on top. as the mulch on our beds kind of decays and composts itself, it's only adding good organic matter into the soil, right? Mulches are a little bit chunkier than your typical compost, so as long as you've done that initial prep with your compost really, really well, every time you're adding mulch, it's only composting in, and then you're mixing that in, and that's helping that air process, right? Mulches is another really good one. The 3 mulches we're going to carry is going to be just the hardwood, the cedar, and then the pecan mulch. Not a huge benefit from one to the next, to be honest, right? A little bit aesthetic. The pecan mulch, if you've never used pecan mulch before, it's a really, I mean, think about pecan shells just kind of ground up. It's really, really fine. It's a really fine, simple texture. It's going to look like this guy here, and I can pass this around if everybody wants to play with it. But what is nice about the pecan mulch is that the squirrels don't tend to love it. It's sharp, right? So there is a little bit of benefit there. But that also means that you don't love it walking through your beds, right? So there is a balance to be had. I think it's aesthetically, it's really, really nice. It's a finer texture than we're used to. But the pecan mulch is going to also help kind of aerate the soil as well when you mix it in. So again, win-win on no matter what kind of mulch you're using as that top dress, right? The humates, though, is like a concentrated compost. So again, add that in before you do your top dress of your new mulch. Yes, ma'am? Not necessarily a full mulching in that way, no. You can, a lot of folks have just to help retain with moisture, but I definitely wouldn't do the standard like 2 to 3 inches of mulch and something like that. Maybe like a ½ an inch, right, just as a little top dress. In the summertime, I tend to do mine. So I've got a couple of raised beds, and I just do a very thin, like I said, maybe about a ½ an inch layer on those just to help with water retention. Yeah, but I don't do a whole lot in my raised beds, yeah. Your raised beds, you're also moving a lot more too, right? Yeah.
It's maybe been about 2 years, but it's like very, very marginal growth.
Okay.
Is there any part of the things here that might help it?
Those two right there would be the products. Okay. So the humates is also really great for all of our established tree, of course, right? And I literally spread it extremely thick at that edge, and then I just use, again, a pitchfork or a spade shovel to kind of work it into the soil. That's where all your feeder roots for the tree are. That's where you're going to get the most bang for the buck. There's hope for it. Mexican sycamores can be a little bit finicky. They're beautiful trees. They're gorgeous, but they can be a little bit finicky in our area. So we can look at some pictures maybe afterwards just to see if there's something else going on, though, that I could help with. Yeah.
The pecan mulch, it seems kind of light. Now, I live in a condo, and I mean, I've got gardens on 3 sides, but if they come through with the blower, are they going to blow that way?
They sure will. Yep. So that's actually a really great point. Yeah, the look is beautiful, but if you're in a space where you're using like a blower, if it's an area that needs heavy raking, the pecan mulch is definitely lighter because it's pecan shells too. Like our hardwood can kind of mat together and hold itself a little bit better. I have noticed that a little bit where it doesn't, what do I want to say, kind of mesh, as much. But what I do really love the pecan mulch for is tilling it into my soils. It adds so much great texture into that soil and loosens that clay up in a hurry. The other great thing with pecans is we have pecans everywhere, so it's a good nutrient to be adding back into the soil as well. Yeah, I will say I don't top dress my beds much with the pecan mulch, but I do use it as an amendment to my soil. So I'll grab a bag anytime I'm doing a new bed and just mix it right in with the compost right into the soil itself. Yeah, really great for that.
When I lived in Massachusetts, just briefly, we had a chocolate factory in our town, and you could go and get free
The cocoa
bags
shells.
of the cocoa.
Yep.
And then when it rained, it smelled like you were baking
Yeah. Yep. There was a Nestle chocolate plant in my hometown when I grew up in upstate. Yep. Same thing though. I remember that. It can be overwhelming at times though too. So let's talk real quick on the difference between granular and liquids, right? So granulars are going to be a slow release. They're really good for your seasonal changes in prepping, right? So like we're talking about mixing them into the soils. These guys are going to release slower. So basically the granular needs to break down before the plant can eat it. Whereas the liquid is pretty much like water, right? So we're able to get this to the plant faster. So if we've got a plant that's under a lot of stress right now, liquid seaweed's going to be your best friend for a situation like that because the plant's going to drink this a lot faster. Think of liquid seaweed as vitamin C for us, right? Or like a multivitamin kind of concept. This is something that you can use very regularly. Most of my plants, I honestly use this in my landscape probably every other week. Really great stuff. This is just basically beefing the cell structure of the plant, so it's literally enlarging the cells. It's making them more drought tolerant and more resilient to things like bugs, disease, and fungus. Okay. Again, spring and fall, I'm mixing this in like crazy. We have a little bit of a competition here in the store of who spends more money in microlife.
Liquid seaweed on all your stuff?
Everything. Yep. Indoor and outdoor. Yeah, it's great. Like if you're starting your spring planting for your herbs and veg kind of thing, it is great to put in for your cuttings, your seedlings. So if you've got like your transplant starts or if you're doing it by seed, liquid seaweed's super fantastic for that. Microlife calls theirs super. I think super seaweed, is that what they call it? Yeah, super seaweed is what Microlife calls theirs. They've got a little extra in there, so it really helps beef up everything. Medina makes one as well that you can get liquid seaweed, so just, depends on your brand favorite, if you will. But so liquid seaweed is going to be an ounce to a gallon of water. Because I use it more than recommended, though, I do half an ounce to a gallon of water, and it just goes a little bit further. Yep. Basically, the more regular you use a fertilizer, you want to dilute it a little bit more, right? And I say fertilizer, technically this is a supplement.
What did you say the other brand was?
Medina is the other main brand, yep. Medina. And is everybody familiar with what the numbers are on a fertilizer? Cool. The way I usually tell people is don't relearn the whole science class and chemistry that you did. Just remember it as leaves, blooms, roots. Okay? The first number is to feed your leaves, the second number is to feed your blooms, and the third number is to feed your roots. You'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, as a supplement, liquid seaweed only has a measurable amount on the third number or the root feed, right? And that's even still just a decimal amount, to be honest. Humates, same concept. We only see it's a 004. Right, again, only helping root development, right, because this is basically a concentrated compost. Their general purpose, and basically the most mild organic fertilizer that you're going to see, is this 624, right? When it comes to fertilizers, we love branding and we love marketing, right? But you'll notice a lot of fertilizers will share the same combination of numbers and label it for other things, right? This is your tomato and veggie one, and it said 846. You know what I mean? So just really what you're after is what the numbers mean. This is something that I use if I've already got, I transition from the 624, I use the 624 like November, December, all the way through February, and then I'll start transitioning to this guy in probably like mid-March, where I know we've got warm days and warm nights, and I know I'm seeing new growth, right? This guy is going to be a little bit more, just kind of a beefier version, if you will, of the general fertilizer. But this one's really great for all of your perennials and things of that nature, right?
You just scatter that like in the base?
I do, yeah. So once I've got my new mulch down for the season, I'll typically scatter it right around the base of the plant. I usually, depending on the plant size, what I try to imagine was how big was the root ball when I planted it, right? And so I kind of go by that visual. And then I water it in right away, especially because, spring we don't always get a ton of rain. If it's about to rain, though, I run outside with all my fertilizers, just that way I can get them all going, right? But that's for my granulars. So I use the liquid seaweed quite often, but the granulars, yeah, like about the size of the root ball.
Is there a brand of non-pellet that you recommend? My dog obsesses over pellets and will dig them out of
Yep, that sounds right. Oh, that's a thing. Thankfully, they're not going to get sick, at least, but it is quite annoying when they go through and till up your entire bed, right? The liquids are probably going to be your best bet then. The only problem is they do stink a little bit more than the granular right away, so you might keep them inside just while you use it kind of thing, but it does dissipate a little bit faster. So the granulars are slower release, means they hang out in the soil longer, so it's probably easier for them to find them longer. You might notice that you'll have to use the liquids more frequently than you typically use your granular. But Medina makes a full line of liquids as well. Microlife I'm just a huge fan of, so that's why I brought this one to talk today kind of thing. But they do make basically their full line in liquids. So once you get into spring for your others, you would jump into those. But for kind of the spring prep, I'm just always recommending that liquid seaweed. But yeah, they do have a full line. Yes, ma'am?
How often do you use that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So like I mentioned earlier, I use the liquid seaweed this time of year, especially with that ice storm and all that heavy stress the plants have, about every 2 weeks. These guys you're going to use about once a month, actually. So granulars are typically about once a month. Your liquids are typically, as a general rule of thumb, about every 14 days.
Just so
Yeah?
that I understand, so the 624, because you're wanting the roots to also develop, you
Yep.
do that one, and then you jump to one.
I jump to like the 846 once we get into the spring when the plant is really producing all that growth, and that's really when it needs more nutrient, basically. Yep. And then the liquid seaweed, I use it all year long.
And you do foliar spray with the seaweed?
I do. If I've got an opportunity where I can do it nice and early in the morning, right? It does have some oils in it, so you don't want to do it when the sun is out, right? So you want this to be either morning or evening. Morning is always best so that the moisture on the leaf can dry out and not worry about fungal issues. If we do it too late in the evening, the foliage stays wet overnight and you can see some fungal concerns from that.
But you also put it around the
Yeah.
leaf?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can mix this into like a hose end sprayer, right? Or you can just mix it right into a watering can.
I use that inside and then
It's great for your houseplants. Yeah. No, it's great. It's honestly, liquid seaweed is like the thing. Yep. Any other big questions on fertilizers for right now? Kind of getting everybody prepped and ready for the spring? Very good. Cool. Well, let's keep popping. We got one more. Maybe I do. Come on, tools. There we go. See, I knew I could do it. So we talked a little bit earlier about our pruners and our loppers. Another really great one is shears. Unfortunately, I don't know if everybody's been keeping up, but with our wonderful friend visiting us at night so regularly, we are down some tools, so I didn't have any shears to show you guys today. But the shears are another one that's really, really great to have on hand. Works awesome for grasses, and it works really well for your more hedge plants, like the dwarf yaupons here. They do give you, when you're using the handhelds, there's typically 16, 18, and 24-inch lengths. The 18 seems to be my best friend for some reason, but you get a little bit more control, and it's a little easier to cut something kind of a hedge row, like I said, your dwarf yaupons, boxwoods, things of that nature. Would be so much faster to do your Texas sages with too, right? Just remember, we're trying to keep that more pyramid shape versus that upward V shape, right? But yeah, those are my top picks. Again, if you have any tools at all, those are the three you should have on hand to be ready for just about any season. Any big questions on tools? Pretty straightforward. Yes?
I've definitely neglected my tools in the yard a time or two.
Yeah.
Before rust has built up.
Yep.
Do you have any solutions for that?
So rust can be a little difficult. There are some products that you can use to clean rust. I would just definitely use a rubbing alcohol after cleaning them and it's dried so that the chemical isn't going to affect your plant when you go to make that cut. Rubbing alcohol is really good to have on hand for your tools, for cleaning your tools in between cuts as well. You can transfer some disease and fungals from plant to plant just by pruning from plant to plant. We usually typically use 70% just standard rubbing alcohol. You can get it like a Walgreens or H-E-B kind of thing, right? We typically use that around this store, and that's what most of us keep on hand. There are what am I trying to think of there? There's like the the rust stuff. CLR, is that what it's called? Like that, you know what I'm talking about? Like that I've used before on a pair of rusty pruners that I've totally accidentally left outside, and that's cleaned it fairly well. But yeah, disinfectant sprays. Most of the time you just want to make sure, we all went through COVID, so we learned a lot about hand sanitizer, right? That 70% number is really important. As long as it's 70% alcohol, it's going to disinfect properly for almost your disease and fungus for your tools. And then like I don't know if I did mention, but we've got the tool sharpening event. We'll have one in the spring and then one in the fall as well. So if you do have a rusty pair, you could bring it into them and they will clean all that for you. Cool. Let's see. Come on. I think that's it, guys. Do you guys have any other questions for me that I can help with that we didn't cover? I think that's going to play. I don't know what that thing's doing. Yes?
Do you recommend using a weed barrier? And if you do have a weed barrier, I have an old one that's not very good anymore.
Yeah.
So do you have to take it all up in order to fertilize under it?
So, in theory, no. Because the weed barrier should allow water to come through. So if you're using a granular fertilizer like the ones we've talked about, they really do activate with the watering. So they're watering and they're going into the soil. So it should still activate fine. I will say I'm personally not a huge fan of weed barriers unless it's for an area like a patio or a gravel space where I'm not going to have plants, where I know I'm not going to be fertilizing or needing to till in the soils. The weed barrier ends up kind of blocking a lot of the organic matter to getting into the soil year after year. I think in theory they sound really, really great, but in the long run, to be honest, they kind of cause a little bit more of a headache. There's some people that love them, some people that hate them. I'm kind of in between. You know, like I said, I use them for some spaces and not others. But I try to avoid them for my plant areas. And also, if you're using mostly native plant material, they typically spread by seed and root. And so the weed barrier is kind of preventing that fill out for you. So yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, you know. A healthy soil too is going to unfortunately welcome so many volunteers, such as weeds, right? But if you keep a good healthy mulch layer on top of your bed, you should be able to overpower that germination rate.
Kind of pivoting
Yeah.
on that is, do you have any like go-tos for getting the weeds out of the way, beating them back?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of horticultural grade vinegar. So the vinegar we use in our kitchens usually like 8 to 9%, I want to say. Horticulture is about 18 to 20%. Works best in a hot sunny day. But that works really, really well. It is a non-selective though, so it is something you want to make sure you've got a good spray bottle for, and don't use it for anything else kind of thing, because the residue does stay. But non-selective means if the wind is blowing and it hits another plant, it will also burn that plant. There's that. We also carry by Fiskars, it's like a little weeding tool. It's got like a little claw with a foot on it that you kind of use it for leverage, right? That works pretty well, especially if you've got just kind of, you know, randoms here and there. If things are popping up and they're rather dense though, the vinegar is great for that because you kind of hit the whole area. Yeah. If you're starting a new bed, you can do the plastic, you know, the black plastic, lay that out for a few months with a few layers of cardboard underneath that'll kind of solarize everything. So if you're starting something new, that can be a good method. But yeah, the vinegar is more of a spot check for me. Yeah?
Just a specific question about pruning, like Esperanza, like the
Yeah.
yellow bells. Is there a place, like, I've heard both ways of.
Totally. So I am the type that's going to cut that one right to the ground. It is such a fast grower that I typically bring it right back to the ground, and because it's such a fast grower, I'm getting my full 6 to 8 foot height every year with full blooms, right? So because it's loving where it's at, I typically cut mine to the ground, yeah. Now you don't have to though. So in a more mild winter, like mine this year is complete, like even the branches that were there have kind of just fallen at this point, right? I have gone through a fairly mild winter with mine where it did start to leaf out on existing branching. It just wasn't, to me, it wasn't as aesthetically pleasing. So the following year I decided, you know, I'm just going to cut it to the ground every year. Yeah.
You don't cut it all the way to the ground, you cut it right.
You're going to follow the same type of pattern, exactly. So anywhere that you're starting to see that leaf out, you're going to still use your proper angle, you know what I mean, and cut every, at the bud, if you will, and you're going to want to take about 1/3 of the way back at least. Yeah. Any other big questions I can hit on, guys? All good? We love it. We love it. Awesome. I greatly appreciate you guys for joining. Like I said, come see me on your way out. I've got the vouchers. A lot of the products we talked about today are also going to be right here. Feel free to ask me any questions you've got on your way out too. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. Thank you guys.